We're going to go ahead and get started then. Good afternoon and welcome to the Tuesday Times Roundtable, where each week we engage in conversation around current global issues, trends, problems, and opportunities that are of interest to you. Our weekly Tuesday Times Roundtables are made possible through a formal partnership with the New York Times. This partnership provides you guys, FIU students, faculty, and staff with free digital access to the New York Times newspaper. My colleagues, Michelle Zaldivar, manning Zoom for us, and Anna Prado, whom you probably met as you came in today, and I, Sherry Beeson, are with the Office of Global Learning Initiatives here at FIU. If you are a Global Medallion student, we want to remind you this event is worth 1 point. If you'd like to know more about the Global Learning Medallion Program, the Peace Corps Prep, or any of our global learning programs, please stick around afterward. You can talk to Michelle, Anna, or me. We'd be happy to fill you in on those. So whether you're joining us live in person here in the Graham Center or live via Zoom, we're glad you're here. Later during our session, we will be taking your questions. So if you're joining us virtually, please post your questions in the chat, and Michelle will share those with us. Otherwise, Anna and I will be making our way around the room with a mic to be sure your answer or your questions are addressed. We also have a couple of special announcements at the end of today's program, so you're going to want to stick around and hear those. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you today's guest speakers, Melba Pearson and Rebecca Richardson Dunlea. Melba Pearson is an attorney specializing in civil rights and criminal law with an emphasis on policy. She is the director of the Policy and Programs for Florida International University's Center for the Administration of Justice, as well as senior fellow and faculty member in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Her work centers on the expansion of the use of prosecutorial performance indicators for more transparency, equity, and racial justice in the criminal justice system. Before joining FIU, Ms. Pearson spent 3 years as Deputy Director of the ACLU of Florida. Sorry, and I just realized I should be clicking forward so you guys can see this information. There she is. Awesome. Okay. So, yes, she spent 3 years as Deputy Director of the ACLU of Florida, where she worked to change police practices, expand voting rights, and reform the criminal justice system. Previously, Ms. Pearson was an assistant state attorney in Miami-Dade County for 16 years, culminating as assistant chief in the career criminal robbery unit, supervising junior attorneys while prosecuting homicides. In 2020, she was the progressive candidate for Miami-Dade State Attorney, receiving close to 155,000 of your votes across party lines. She lives in Miami Beach with her husband, Bill. Rebecca Richardson Dunlea is an assistant professor in the FIU Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. She received her bachelor's in psychology and economics from Wellesley College, and both her master's and PhD in criminology and criminal justice from the University of Maryland. Dr. Dunlea's research focuses broadly on courtroom decision-making, with a current emphasis on prosecutorial discretion and sociodemographic disparities in case processing outcomes. Her work at the Center for the Administration of Justice focuses on data-informed prosecution and helping state attorneys' offices become more effective and fair through the improvement of data and analytical capacity. She previously worked on research related to evidence-based sentencing, including a 2-year project which evaluated the potential impacts of evidence-based sentencing on punishment decisions and social inequality in partnership with the state of Connecticut. Dr. Dunlea's research has been published in journals such as the Journal of Research in Crime and Delinquency and Criminal Justice Policy Review. Her current work is funded by the MacArthur Foundation, the Koch Foundation, and the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Please join me in welcoming both our guest presenters, Melba Pearson and Rebecca Dunlea.
Sure. So, hey, again, good afternoon, everyone. It's definitely an honor and a privilege to be here to talk a little bit about our work and the potential impacts that we hope to have on the criminal justice system as a whole. Our comments are going to be centered around the use of data. We, as mentioned in the introduction, are part of the Prosecutorial Performance Indicators Project, which is based here at the Center for the Administration of Justice, which we will get into the details about how it works, a little bit about how it was developed, and what we hope to measure, and how that information can be used by elected prosecutors as well as voters, citizens, community members, to really get a firm handle on what's happening in their community and what changes should be put in place. So starting off, what are the PPIs? So the PPIs, like I mentioned before, Prosecutorial Performance Indicators, PPIs for short. It's a suite of 55 different indicators or metrics that we use to look at the health of a prosecutor's office, kind of look holistically at how are they working with communities? How quickly, for instance, does it take for a line prosecutor to reach out to a survivor of crime when they've come into the system? Is it days? Is it weeks? Is it months? How many cases end up going into a diversion program, which is basically an off-ramp out of the criminal justice system in order to get people's life on track? Is that a small percentage or a larger percentage? What types of charges are being filed? And of course, as we've all really dove deeper into this as a community, as a country over the course of the last year or so, with the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, what does racial justice look like in a particular community? Are people getting different outcomes based on what their zip code is, or what complexion the survivor of crime is? So these are the types of things that the PPIs look to measure. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily give you an answer, right? It tells you the numbers, but then that's where the policy change has to come in. But I'll pivot to Rebecca to see if you want to add anything else with regards to the buckets.
Sure, yeah, no, that was great. So our 55 indicators are broadly organized under these three key topics or objectives that we think about. Capacity and efficiency, which is a very internal looking type of goal for a prosecutor's office. So do they have the staff that they need to be effective? Are they selecting the right cases and prioritizing the more serious cases to spend their time and limited resources on? That's capacity, that's efficiency. The second large bucket that we have is community safety and well-being. And you kind of touched on this. This is about what does crime look like in a community? How do we protect and serve victims? How do we engage and do outreach better with the community so that there is a stronger tie between a state attorney's office or a prosecutor's office and the communities that they serve? The last major bucket is fairness and justice. And that racial disparities assessing racial disparity is a very big part of the PPI work, and it's a very big part of the fairness and justice sense. So other categories there include minimizing unnecessary punitiveness and preserving prosecutorial ethics and integrity. So these indicators are designed to take us past what has traditionally been a very limited focus on how many convictions there are and how long prosecutors are sending people away to prison or jail for.
Yeah, because back for the longest time, that was the only way people really measured success of a prosecutor's office, right? Being a former prosecutor myself, having done that work for 16 years, it was all about how many trials did you had, how many convictions, and did you get a life sentence? And it's kind of was just ingrained in the culture. It wasn't like no one ever really gave it a second thought. But now that we're sort of evolving in what justice looks like and trying to be more holistic to make sure we're being responsive to communities, as we evolve, a new model needs to come into place, and that's what we hope the prosecutorial performance indicators, the role it would play in our greater community.
And one other note that I'll make, this is very much about the office level culture, right? We can't blame any individual line prosecutor for what's going on here. If you get started as an assistant state attorney, you're a line prosecutor working your cases, and you're told that you're going to get promoted once you've had a certain amount of trial experience, once you've gotten a certain conviction rate, and once we've seen that you are capable of putting serious offenders away for 20 years, that's what you're going to think is important, right? That's what you're going to focus on. So this isn't about changing the decisions of any individual prosecutor in the office. This is about changing office culture and getting the entire institution of prosecution to think more broadly about what they can do to better achieve justice in this country.
So some of the goals of the PPIs include, first of all, developing data and analytic capacity in a prosecutor's office. So what does that mean, right? Like, that sounds really fancy. Let me break it down. So when we're talking about data and analytical capacity, there's no like special sauce, right? It's literally going into the prosecutor's case management system. Every office has one. Now, some are fancier than others, some are more effective than others, but everyone has some sort of case management system to keep track of the cases that are coming in, the dispositions, and sort of the status and that sort of thing. So it's about being able to take that data out of your case management system and make sense of it, and then use that to inform policies and decisions as to how you're going to move forward in a more reasoned manner, as opposed to, well, I think this is what's going on, or I heard this, or I received political pressure to do X. This is a data-driven, mindset in order to be able to move forward. Also, it's about tracking the progress in a prosecutor's office and a prosecutor's performance over time. Now, again, this is not designed to be a human resources tool like, okay, what's your specific, a success rate and what are you doing specifically? It's looking at the office as a whole. So the question is it that the average prosecutor has like 300 cases, right? That's really high. You don't want any part of that. I've done it. But if you see that the numbers of cases are trending very high for individual prosecutors, well, what do you do with that information? That should mean you should either hire more staff, or maybe it might be a discussion with the chief judge to add more divisions, more judges to be able to hear more cases. So seeing that will trigger hopefully a response or a policy shift. So that's how the tracking the progress comes into play. Also, identify racial and ethnic disparities in case processing along with solutions. So as I touched on earlier, if you see an instance where it's like, listen, when it comes, and we discovered this recently with regards to diversion. We looked at a number of different of our sites that we're working with, and we noticed pretty much across the board that black defendants, or defendants that identify as black, were less likely to get diversion in felony cases than white defendants. There could be a number of reasons for that. In seeing that, in knowing that information, now it is incumbent upon the elected prosecutor to be like, wait a minute, this is a disparity, this is not okay, what do I need to do to address this? Is it about changing the requirements to be able to get into a diversion program? Is it that the average diversion program costs $500, and if you're somebody who is under-resourced, you're working at a big box store, you're working at a fast food restaurant trying to hold down 3 jobs and pay your bills, you can't afford to go to diversion, right? Which means you are now excluded from getting this benefit of being able to be routed out of the criminal justice system. And now how is that fair? So that's just one example of identifying racial and ethnic disparities. I could go on forever on that, but you guys hopefully get the gist on that. And then also building stronger ties and communication channels between prosecutors and community. Oftentimes, the way that prosecutors look at community engagement is either A, by virtue of me coming to work, I'm serving the community. Check, done, that's it. Others are like, well, we have a community prosecution unit or a community engagement unit. That's their job. My job is to be in a courtroom. They can go out and go to community meetings. So it's more about, okay, well, what are some other ways that line prosecutors can get involved in the community so that, number one, they're hearing their concerns, they're seeing firsthand some of the problems that result from either being involved in the criminal justice system as someone who's been charged or as someone who is a survivor of crime. Speaking from my own experience, I spent 2 years as a community prosecutor, and it was incredibly eye-opening for me because I interacted with people I never would have under any other circumstances. And when I returned back to the courtroom to do trial work, I approached my work in a whole different way because now I understand some of the struggles that people are facing in this particular community. So just, using that as an example, there's definitely a lot of opportunity for that growth and collaboration and to really hear firsthand from the community what their concerns are and then implement that into policy as opposed to being, in some ways, not necessarily intentionally, paternalistic and being like, I'm going to tell you what you need because I'm the expert, right? Is having this collaboration with the community to make sure that you're addressing their needs. So some of the sites we're working in, right now, we're working in Broward County with the newly elected state attorney there, Harold Pryor. We're working in Charleston, South Carolina, Chicago with Kim Fox. We started with her just about in the beginning of her tenure as state attorney there. Jacksonville State Attorney's Office, Lake County, which is located in Illinois, Milwaukee, Montgomery County, which I'm headed to as soon as I leave this presentation today. We're working with that state attorney there who's actually been in office a number of years. So it's not a matter of only the newer elected prosecutors want to engage. It's a mix of new and more seasoned elected prosecutors, as well as Democrat and Republican. So this is not like a progressive thing or whatever. This is a data thing. This is a justice thing, right? We're also working with the newly elected district attorney in New Orleans, Orlando State Attorney Monique Worrell, Philadelphia with Larry Krasner, Portland, San Joaquin County in California, Santa Clara County in California, Tampa, and now most recently, the Colorado District Attorney's Council, which is basically the entire state of Colorado, which is huge. We don't plan on sleeping anytime soon. It's fine. Justice never sleeps.
We don't need that. I like what you said. It's a data thing. That's a good transition into this next slide. So the PPIs is, at this point, a very large, as Melba just demonstrated, research and technical assistance project. So technical assistance meaning that we provide services in a way to prosecutors' offices, and we help them accomplish their own goals. But we work at a university. Most of us on the team, Melba's our shining exception, are researchers. So we make sure that there is a research component to our work so that we can help both advance the field of criminal justice, but also help advance the scholarship in criminal justice as well. So whenever we do a project in a site and provide our full scope of services, there are four main sort of research-related objectives that we work toward. So we will often start out by doing one-on-one or very small group interviews, confidential interviews with individual line attorneys in an office. So we'll do we'll pick about 25 randomly selected attorneys and get their sense of what does it mean to be a successful prosecutor? How do you judge your own performance, and how do others in your office judge your performance? What do you think about community engagement? Do you do it? Do you not? What does that look like? What do you think about racial disparities? Like, what causes them? How do you see that manifest in your day-to-day work? A variety of things like that. We end every interview by asking them about data and saying, what kind of metrics should we look at in your office that would, show you how good a job that you and others in your office are doing. So those interviews are very informative so that we get a sense of the current culture in an office, and that's how we help figure out what we need to do and the direction that we need to take to be most effective in helping them get where they want to go. After the interviews, we usually accompany those with an office-wide online survey. So that will be pretty much anonymous. We hope to get as many people in an office's perspective on what's going on. So it's a little bit less in-depth than those individual interviews are, but you get like a broader range of perspectives, right? So what's important to you, what's not? Do you have any advice for the office on how to improve? What would help you do your work better? Things like that. Those are questions that we would ask to everybody in an office. We do not get 100% response rates. Normally, we can get anywhere from like 50 to 60% would be considered quite good. In any survey research, I think that was pretty good. But that's kind of what we aim for. But we aim to get as representative a sample as we can in office. The third component of a PPI project is the creation of an external-facing dashboard. So as Melba mentioned, we try to extract or get data from the case management system of every office that we work with. And that's so we can use that data to create these metrics that are measured over time. So you want to know, say, what racial disparities look like in diversion. It's actually a slide later. I'll show you what it looks like in one jurisdiction. But say you want to know, you work in a prosecutor's office, and you want to know what racial disparities look like. You're not just interested in that figure at one point in time, right? That's not that helpful. But what does become helpful is if you track that same metric every month or every quarter or every year and see how it changes in your office. Because your office is not like other offices. It's not really going to do you that much good to compare your figures to other offices. There's always going to be pretty big differences, right? How people operate and how offices operate. But you can compare your current performance to what your performance looked like last year or last quarter or even last month. And you can see whether disparities are improving, whether your efficiency is improving, whether the community feels like a stronger connection, and whether your community outreach is improving. So with our PPIs, we aim to track performance over time. And when we create these indicators using data drawn from those case management systems, we help the offices get them up on an external-facing dashboard so that the office can show the community what their performance looks like over time as well. The last component of a PPI project is doing an analysis of racial disparity. You kind of addressed this pretty well already. But we use that same data drawn from case management systems to look at differences typically between Black, white, and Latinx defendants. Depending on how race and ethnicity are measured in office, that looks a little bit different from one place to another. But we'll assess differences in outcomes across the realm of prosecutorial decision making. So we'll look at disparities in everything from which cases get filed, through diversion, through how charges change, go up and down through a case, to what final dispositions look like. And we use that information to start a conversation with the office about, let's figure out where the biggest disparities are and what we might be able to do to help fix them moving forward. And then as a transition to the next part, in a recent project that we have been working on, we are taking a more proactive approach to using the data, using the PPIs to connect offices with the communities that they serve. So there is sort of a research component here in that we are trying to create essentially a blueprint of what prosecutors' offices can and should be doing to use data to build a bridge and to better talk and communicate with people in the communities that have more information that would be useful to them, and to help figure out what those communities feel is important for them to be doing.
Now it's all about the community. So of course, this is all about the community, right? Because at the end of the day, a prosecutor's job is to serve a community, right? To make sure that justice is being had, that everyone gets equal access to justice in a particular community, right? So this is sort of, we came up with a new approach on how to do this. In the beginning of this project, the first few years of this project, it was very much focused on getting the data and getting the metrics right, because if, that's the foundation. If we don't have that right, building on top of that just doesn't make sense. You don't build a house on a faulty foundation. Doesn't end well, right? So the reality is, now that we've got the data portion, really in a solid fashion, now we're like, okay, how can we engage the community so that they can understand how best to use this information, right? So you put up this dashboard, but if folks don't understand its purpose or how to use it, then in some ways, it's not the goal that we want, right? So how we go about this is, first of all, doing what we call a listening tour. So the elected prosecutor and members of their executive team, it varies based on schedule and all of that, but members of the state attorney's office or district attorney's office will join a town hall or a forum where basically we open it up to the community to talk about different systemic issues that they've seen in the criminal justice system in their particular area. The goal is to move past the, well, my son has been locked up for 5 years and all of that. While that's still valid and important, that may not necessarily be a systemic issue. But one example that I'd like to give, coming from Jacksonville, this was during the time I was at the ACLU of Florida, where I think it's the Jacksonville Times Tribune, or their major newspaper, one of their investigative journalists did a deep dive with regards to, quote unquote, walking while black, where basically black residents of Jacksonville were getting ticketed and arrested at a higher rate for not walking on the sidewalk. Let me let that marinate for a second. Another important issue around that is that some communities don't have sidewalks, right? It's just because, again, the mindset is everybody drives, so, no big deal. You just drive up to your front door, right? But if you take public transportation and you get off the bus, how are you supposed to get from the bus stop to your house? You're obviously going to walk. And if there's no sidewalk, obviously you're not going to walk down the middle of the street, but you're going to walk more towards the swale. Well, unfortunately, black people were getting arrested for doing just that. So as a result of that investigative journalist work, clearly the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office and others, got together and made some major changes around that. But the goal of these listening tours and the actual listening sessions, so the sessions, maybe 2 or 3 sessions that make up the bigger tour of it in and of itself, the goal is to identify some of those issues before it has to get to the point of an investigative journalist or somebody realizing later on down the line that there's a problem. So in these listening tours, we end up doing it in collaboration with a community partner. So that way it's, FIU, Loyola, a research team, plus a community group, so that people can be like, oh, wait a minute. All right, these are neutral parties, right? This isn't something put on by the prosecutor's office to, the perception may be, this is about re-election. This is just to make yourself look good. You really don't want to have a discussion with us. This is just for show. But when they see there's sort of these neutral validators coming in, wanting to have these discussions, people respond very differently and are much more likely to, number one, attend, and number two, be very transparent and honest in their feelings. In these sessions, the state attorney's office or the district attorney's office does not speak. They give a brief, I give a brief introduction, introduce who's on the call. They may give a quick welcome, 2-3 minutes, but the rest of the time, they listen. Because again, too often when they come to communities, it can end up being a type of situation where I'm telling you all the things that I'm doing and not necessarily really having a dialogue with the community to hear what their concerns are. So that's why we structured it in that manner. Currently, of course, these are being done via Zoom. We hope to return to a time where we can get everyone in the same room, give everybody lunch, dinner, whatever, and really have that in-person fellowship. But until such time, we continue to do these on Zoom. Now, after we have these listening sessions, we sort of sit down and really digest the themes that keep recurring over and over again, and use that to, number one, help frame which indicators of the PPIs that end up being selected for future study in that jurisdiction. Because if you keep hearing over and over again that people don't feel that they have access to the system, or they're not understanding the process, or don't understand what's fully going on, then again, that's something that may need to be quantified through data, really validating their lived experience, and then policy change can be shifted as a result. Again, a much more robust view. The second component of that is a community advisory board. So sometimes in the listening sessions, certain community members kind of rise to the top as really having good feedback and interesting lived experience and have a lot to contribute. So the goal is to create a community advisory board in every jurisdiction that we're working in, and we've done that in about 2 or 3 at this juncture. And the community advisory board is made up of 13, not always the best number, but somewhere between 9 and 11 people to, number one, look at the different indicators that we are offering, the 55 indicators, and give input as to which ones are most relevant to the experience of this community. What really needs to be quantified so that the elected prosecutor can make decisions with regards to policy. Then once that's done, and if we moved a little further along, we like to show them the dashboard in advance to make sure it's accessible. Because again, we look at it, we're like, oh man, this is amazing, this is the best dashboard ever. But then if the average person looks at it and is like, I don't get it, we kind of defeated the purpose, right? We want to make sure that the average person can just click on it, look at the different metrics, click on the things of interest to them, and use that to inform their decisions moving forward, whether it's a matter of they need to educate each other on what the office is doing, whether it means that a different decision needs to be made at the polling station, right? I mean, all of these things, but it's all about educating the public so that they can make the best decisions for their community. So the Community Advisory Board looks at the dashboard to help us work through accessibility and understandability, if that's a word, but anyway. And then the last component of it is once all of that work is done, assisting in that policy piece, right? Because it's one of those situations where, you know, we may sit down and brainstorm what we think is an amazing policy idea, right? But then if you had asked somebody, they would have told you, no, that wouldn't work the way you think it would have, right? And I think we can all come up with examples of misguided policies that were like, did you ask the average person? With regards to anything, right? Not only just in the criminal justice context. So that's why it's really important to make sure you have some sort of representation from the community to fully understand the intended and the unintended consequences of a particular policy change, and make sure we're not making misguided decisions that will end up causing harm to communities rather than aiming for harm reduction. So they would serve as a thought partner moving forward with the prosecutor's office into perpetuity. Now, this is not like one of those things where every week they've got to be, you know, up in the prosecutor's face, because that is not productive. But it would move to more of a quarterly model where every time there's new data, new metrics, or new information coming out, they have that ability to be in partnership with the elected prosecutor and make decisions, not necessarily make decisions, but make suggestions accordingly that hopefully the elected prosecutor would then go ahead and implement.
Okay, so somewhat ironically, for a project that helps to create metrics that measure performance, it can be really tricky to measure how well we're doing in an office. When we start working with a new prosecutor's office and we figure out what do we want to accomplish, what should we see at the end of this that will indicate to us that we've been successful and done our job here. So it gets really tricky because a lot of what we feel our biggest moments of progress happen not behind closed doors, but there's nothing like recorded about them. Like we'll just see changes in how they think about how line prosecutors think about data. A new policy will come out that we can kind of connect to some of the data that we've helped them put together, but we don't necessarily say like, that policy, that's the result of that data point. Like that was us. We don't really do that much. But there are a few ways that we can see by the end of a project that we have been successful. And one of the key ones is that we have actually produced and gotten up online a dashboard, right? That's something that anybody can go to a website and see. There's the dashboard. Check it off, we did it. And how the dashboard gets used and whether it actually becomes policy relevant, separate question. But in the offices that we work with, we are generally successful in getting a data dashboard up online. We also produce a number of reports, typically in the sites we work in, so data from interviews, data from the surveys that we do. Those will go into reports that we produce to give to the office. But then we also will release publicly to let the local community see what we've been doing. So what does a dashboard, what does a data dashboard look like? This is an example of a PPI measured over time in a single jurisdiction. So this is based on actual data from Milwaukee County. And this is an interesting one because it shows a very dramatic change over time. So this indicator captures whether or not an office is contacting its victims quickly, contacting the victims that it works with quickly after a case is referred to the office. So essentially, when a line prosecutor gets a violent case or something that involves an actual victim, because not all crimes have victims, but when a case with a victim does come through the door, how quickly is the line prosecutor talking to the victim, asking them what they want to see, asking them to give their side of the story or to provide additional information? And in theory, the sooner that the prosecutor does that, the more the victim is going to feel that they have agency in the process, is going to feel that they have a say in what happens with that case. So the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office actually kind of informally prioritized contacting victims. So they use this PPI, which clearly, if you follow the line, shows a change over time. Between 2017 and 2020, it took, in 2017, an average of 54 days for a line prosecutor to contact the victim in a case. But after a big push by the office to reduce that number and make that contact faster, they got it down pretty significantly to an average of about 2 days by 2020. Now, COVID, 2020, very weird, but you can see even pre-COVID there was a pretty significant drop here. So we know that it wasn't just related to the pandemic. So this office uses this data point, which is up on their website, to show the community that contact with victims is something that they prioritize, and they want the community to know that they've been doing a better job of it. So this is a very positive indicator from Milwaukee County. Here's another example from Cook County, Chicago, Illinois. This indicator looks at racial disparities in diversion placements, which, for those who may not be familiar, diversion in a prosecutor's office is a program or a set of programs that gives services to a defendant who might need them. And diversion is typically offered, and if the defendant accepts and then completes the program, they don't get a conviction in their case and they don't have to serve any other punishment. So it's an alternative to conviction or potentially to incarceration also. So it's a good thing. Going into diversion more is a good thing. So looking at racial disparities in diversion, this graph shows us that pretty consistently, Black defendants are less likely to be diverted month over month. Now, there's a 0 line in the middle, that's the dark one. When the bars go below the 0, that means that Black defendants are less likely to get diversion. So as you can see here, every bar is below 0. It means that every month, there is a disparity that disadvantages Black defendants in placements in diversion programming. However, over time, the bars seem to be getting a little bit closer to 0, which is why, as we emphasize, looking at the same data point over time is important. Because without the context of knowing that disparities were quite large back at the beginning of 2018, you might look at what's happening in 2020 and say, that's really bad. Like, there's a big disparity here. We need to fix it. Like, we need to get on this right away. And not that it's not something that should continue to be addressed, but there is context here. It was a lot worse, and the office has been steadily working on reducing that disparity through various policies. So that's why we very heavily emphasize the importance of measuring these different metrics, because you get a much wider, fuller picture of what's going on when you do that. Okay. Other types of research that we do, again, we'll put out reports, we'll publish academic papers using the data that we collect. So this is just a smattering of findings that some of our research has found. For example, through interviews, we've found pretty consistently that when a new state or district attorney comes into an office saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to reduce incarceration, I'm going to reduce racial disparities, I'm going to make this office fairer, they have to communicate that to their line staff, right? Like, they have to figure out how to get everybody in the office on board. Because it's not the state or district attorney that's actually going to be making the decisions in every case. So you've got to figure out how to get the culture in your office, how to get everybody on board with you. The problem we've identified is that it's that middle group of managers who don't always communicate what the person at the top is saying down to the line prosecutors. So the line prosecutors don't always find out immediately when there's been a policy change or a priority change that may affect how they think about their work or do their job. There's a little bit, I love this quote, it's a clog in the drain. Another finding, prosecutors want to be colorblind. So when prosecutors are elected into office saying, I'm going to reduce racial disparities, they're inheriting offices where their line prosecutors are like, okay, that's great, but like that's not my job. Like I think I shouldn't be looking at race. Like it would be best if I just straight up didn't know the race of each defendant. So I'm just gonna pretend like I don't, and we'll just keep going from there. So prosecutors wanna be colorblind. This is a finding in a paper that's coming out soon in criminology, so stay tuned if you're interested in that particular one. An example of a finding that we get from doing surveys, we're actually able to identify pretty interesting orientations that different prosecutors have toward their work. So we've labeled them progressive versus traditional, but it's almost like a typology. Like we can kind of tell you based on how prosecutors responded to different items. Things like, tell me on a scale of 1 to 5, how important is it to focus on reducing disparities? How important is it to minimize punitiveness? And that prosecutors tend to think in the same way as some, but not all, of the other line prosecutors in their office. So some prosecutors are consistently more progressive in their answers, and some are consistently more traditional. Using other analyses, using data from case management systems, we have, this probably doesn't surprise anybody, identified pretty substantial racial disparities in a number of case outcomes. However, racial disparities don't look the same across every different stage of a case. So there's some fluctuation, like when disparities emerge and when outcomes tend to be more equal if you're looking at that particular point. So there are particular case decisions, diversion outcomes in particular, incarceration outcomes, and lengths of prison and jail sentences, where you see disparities are particularly large. But it's not every point, it's not every decision. And lastly, this one also may not come as a shock. COVID has absolutely changed case processing in so many ways. The number and the types of cases that prosecutors get, the way that they're able to handle them. I mean, courts were closed for 6, 8 weeks, sometimes multiple, more months in offices across the country. And that's really impacted prosecutors' ability to do their job and process cases. So looking at trends over time through 2020 and 2021 is, well, super interesting, but it can at times paint a bit of a bleak picture. But we are going to have a lot of challenges in the criminal justice system to overcome moving forward as we, whenever we do get to the end of the pandemic. So it's important to continue using data and track how things look post-pandemic and see whether we're actually improving outcomes.
What you want me to talk about the? Oh yeah. Okay. Perfect. All right. We got this. We got this.
We got it.
So
a lot.
Right. So of course, this is in partnership with the New York Times, so we have to talk about the New York Times. And big fan. I do subscribe. So the New York Times did a very interesting article chronicling what's happening with the newly elected Queens District Attorney. And there was some, one of those things where she was elected. It was this sort of this progressive wave that she came in on, and there was a lot of hope and there was a lot of expectations, right? And now we're kind of a year in, right? And things aren't exactly going the way that others, had hoped. Part of it because of COVID, obviously, because the court systems basically got shut down. Courts were closed, so you couldn't actually dispose of cases or anything like that. But one of the big things that was coming out was concerns around her conviction integrity unit. And so let me back up for a second. A conviction integrity unit goes by a number of names. It could be, justice review, conviction review, case review unit. Basically, the goal of these units is to look back at old convictions and see if a conviction was a wrongful conviction. If that is the case, then the person who is incarcerated should be exonerated and released. Obviously, if the case was solid and done appropriately, then everything stands as it does. But there's been this real push nationally to really utilize these conviction integrity units for the purposes of especially reviewing those cases from like the 80s and 90s when sentencing was much more about, this is a war on drugs, we've got to give everybody the max, we've got to give everybody a minimum mandatory, that sort of mindset. Now that we've evolved as a system, we have to look back at those decisions and be like, wait a minute, does this guy really need to be doing life in prison for stealing, $7 worth of whatever from Walmart? Like, again, thinking of the 3 strikes laws and those sorts of things that will end up resulting in a minimum mandatory. So one of the complaints that folks had about her was that things just weren't moving as quickly and all of that. Now, for a little bit of context, she took over from a longtime incumbent who was in office for like 40 years. And his mindset was basically like, progress what? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? He came from the hardcore old school, and he was not ashamed to say that, he believed in maximum sentences, he believed in being harsh and punitive, and saw no shame in it, right? Again, he came from a different era and a different mindset, so this is not a judgment on him. He is a reflection of the time that he came up in. So one of the things I think is one of the biggest takeaways from this article is the fact that 1 year is not enough time to undo 40 years of systemic injustice. I think there's a lot of impatience that we've seen even through our work in our studies, which is like, okay, I know you got in office in January, it's now September, how come you haven't fixed racism yet? How does that make sense, right? You've got to keep people time to get in there. First of all, you've got the quote unquote clogs in the drain, right? That you have to somehow work around, work through, or guide them out the door, right? And it's not always the best idea to come in on day one and fire a whole bunch of people because that kills morale. And then also, you've got to replace those people. And if you don't have the funds or the pipeline, you've now really undid the office in so many different ways, and also potentially harmed survivors of crime or victims of crime because now you don't have the people to handle the cases. So you have to be strategic. So the key here is to have realistic expectations when a new district attorney or prosecutor is elected. Also, that data is key in setting new policies. And again, you've got to have the data in order to be able to do those policy changes. If you haven't even had time to sit down, get in there, and take a look at what's been happening, you're now running into the risk of just implementing policies without having that solid footing behind it. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't. So that's why it's a better practice to always make sure you have the data so that when you're explaining the policy change, you're not only explaining the problem, but you're also showing the physical evidence, or otherwise known as the receipts, to justify why this change is necessary. Also, the mere existence of a conviction integrity unit doesn't necessarily mean that anything's happening. So in some jurisdictions, it could be considered purely cosmetic because we're not getting any data as to how many attorneys are in that actual unit, how many cases they reviewed over the course of a year, how many exonerations came out of it, if the cases were not resulting in an exoneration, as to why, what's the percentage of that, what's the average amount of time it takes to review some of these old cases. All of those things are key data points that the public needs to know as well. So if you just come out as an announcement and say, hey, I got a conviction integrity unit, that's a good start, but you've got to follow up on that. And I'm going to even give a local example. So there's a case that was featured in GQ magazine of a man by the name of Thomas Raynard James. And he is currently in prison serving life for robbery and a homicide, and all evidence indicates that he did not do it. He's been in prison since the 90s. It's a very long kind of, to get into the weeds of the story, it's got a lot of twists and turns, but sum and substance, there was somebody else they were looking at for that crime that had the same exact name as him. So when the officers went and pulled a photo ID for, basically a one photo lineup to give to the eyewitness, they were like, yeah, that's him. Because again, looking at the time frame when this happened in the 90s, we did not know a lot of the things we know now about eyewitness testimony and how unreliable it can be, right? And that's why now they don't do the single photo lineup unless you know the defendant, right? The victim or the survivor knows the person that they're seeking to charge. Otherwise, it's a 12 photo lineup. So there were a number of errors and a number of problems going on in that case, and he had been trying to get his freedom for all of these years, and it was only after the GQ article that things started to go in motion. So it's currently being reviewed by the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office's Conviction Integrity Unit. Justice Project, excuse me, that's the term that they have for it. However, it's been reviewed for the last 7 months. 7 months. So again, that leaves a lot of questions out there to be answered. So those are the types of things that people have to keep in mind as we explore data and look at some of these stories in the news. You have to realize there's also a lot more behind it, and in order to have that accountability, you need that transparency.
Okay, this is the last slide, but I want to make sure that we have time to answer any questions you have. So I will just say that this is a large project that we've been working on since about 2018. It did not start as big as it is, but it can be really hard to break into a new area, especially with like a group like prosecutors who are generally very data phobic. They're very skeptical of any kind of change, at least in our recent experience. So it's really important that if you are interested in working with prosecutors or any other criminal justice practitioners, or probably practitioners anywhere at any time or any place, it's important to go in with a sense of reciprocity and to make sure that you are trying to establish a meaningful, mutually beneficial partnership with the people that you're working with. So we get access to prosecutors' offices, which is quite difficult to do, and not many people have been that successful at it, because we offer them technical assistance and we offer them our help and our guidance and our random musings for several years in order to get data and to do what we need to do as researchers and improve the field. So we really try to make our partnerships mutually beneficial and make sure that the offices that we work with feel that they've gotten a good deal out of our partnerships or out of our work. That helps, for finding our prosecutorial partners, but it also helps make sure that the work we do is meaningful and doesn't just get tossed on a shelf to collect dust at the end of our work. So if anybody here is interested in doing this kind of applied work, whether it's research or otherwise, just make sure that you approach it trying to make it beneficial for yourself, but also for the people that you're working with. And then it becomes a true partnership and you start to see. Stop there. Thank you, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Yes. Bring on the questions. And by the way, if folks are interested in learning more about the case that I mentioned of Thomas Raynard James, we're actually going to have the author of the GQ article, Tristan Corton. We're going to do a Zoom session with him, I believe is October 12th. I'll make sure to send the information to Sherry so that can be disseminated.
That's what I was just going to ask you about. What can we do? Like, is there anything we can do to help, like, bring justice to this matter? Because it's crazy that everything you mentioned, I just can't, like, fathom the fact that he's still in there and then still nothing's happening. So if there's anything like students, maybe a petition, is there anything we can do at all?
Yeah, I mean, those are, first of all, one thing that I encourage everyone to start with is learn more about the case. Because the top line that I gave you is not even the half of it. And I mean, this could be a 2-hour session on that alone. So, definitely learn more about the case to understand sort of the injustices that have occurred in that. Also, it's about raising awareness, right? So you know about the story. Now is to tell your friends, family, and colleagues so that more people are aware of it. And whether it be doing something on social media to raise awareness, so doing a campaign on Instagram or Twitter, again, hashtag free Thomas Raynard James or something like that to get the awareness out there, that's important. A petition would be helpful as well, do like a Move On? Yeah, is it Move On that does the petitions, or is it Color? No. Anyway, one of those really huge, popular platforms to be able to do petitions would be another way to get the awareness out there and keep the pressure on, because I think the reality is, I know this is a New York Times thing, but I do have to use the Washington Post quote of democracy dies in darkness. Right? And when people don't know, they can't advocate, and things just kind of slide under the radar. And so it's our duty as voters, it's our duty as citizens, as residents, as anybody who draws breath in this country, to understand the issues at play and to advocate and fight against injustice when you see it, because today it might be somebody else, but tomorrow it might be you.
Hi. Being that I don't want to say that we live in an age where social justice is trending, but I'll just say as like a Black person living in the South, I was able to see very much a difference after the George Floyd incident. Not saying that anything's like performative, but how do you decipher when like helping people who are going through the criminal justice system that they aren't just taking advantage of what's going on now? Because of course there are people who are actually criminals and they just happen to be Black. So how do you decipher between those two?
Okay, so this is more directed towards people that are charged in the system, not elected prosecutors per se. Yeah. Okay, I got you. Mind if I take it? Or? Yeah, okay, all right. Yeah, because I sometimes have an issue being dominant. I'm fully aware of that.
Chime in.
Right. So listen, a prosecutor's job is still to seek justice, period, end of story, right? And if you have somebody that, killed somebody, or, for instance, R. Kelly, right? He's a defendant, he's Black, no question about it, but he was out here doing some horrific things to, underage girls and boys, right? So that's not a matter of, what should we do? This is like, listen, you did something wrong and you've got to be held accountable for it. Now, what does accountability look like? So if Harvey Weinstein, in that same situation, if he was going to get a life sentence, let's say that that's the appropriate thing, and I'm not advocating for life first, I'm just giving that as an example. But let's say Harvey Weinstein, similar types of crimes, even though not underage, but still it was assault, right? He gets a life sentence, then okay, equity is R. Kelly in this situation, comparable crimes, gets a life sentence. But if it's R. Kelly gets a life sentence, but Harvey Weinstein gets 10 years, that's a problem. Right? Because now you're seeing disparities. So the argument is never, in my opinion, and there's going to be folks out there who are abolitionists. I respect them. I disagree. But, people have different ways of viewing the system. But the key is making sure that similarly situated people are receiving similar outcomes. Another example, the Stanford sexual assault case, right? Where that young man did some horrible things to that poor girl who was unconscious. And it was like, oh, but he could swim for the Olympics. He has such an amazing future ahead of him. Just give him probation. But then a Black athlete, and I believe he was out of Wisconsin, who was on the football team, same type of charge, he got some 25 years in prison. So again, that's the disparity. So it's not about, just let all the Black folks free and put all the white folks in prison. That's not justice, right? It's making sure that similarly situated people get similar outcomes.
The only thing I would add is to say that I think right now our criminal justice system, I assume you would agree with this, is we are just too far to the side of punitiveness and giving people really harsh punishments, even when there's not really that much evidence that they're effective or that those sentences are actually going to reduce the chance that people will offend again in the future. So if we even as a criminal justice system, I say we, I'm not in it, but if the criminal justice system just makes any progress back toward interfering less in everybody's lives, I think that would be a step in the right direction. But it does have to be equal for everybody. So, I mean, I'm a researcher. I look at data in the aggregate. I don't ever like do analysis on an individual case. So my perspective is a little bit different than, like, for example, yours, who you were like, you know, you will get hyper-focused as a prosecutor on a case and what's the right thing in that case. And I'm thinking, what's the right thing if we take a step back and look at all the cases together? And that's where the similarly situated bit comes in, like what's happening to the group of black defendants versus the group of white defendants. And sometimes it's just a weird concept, but like sometimes there are going to be individual cases in those groups that don't feel right, or that don't feel like they were the exact perfect outcome. However, they can still be contributing to overall justice and like greater, you know, helping achieve greater fairness overall. So there's a weird tension between making sure that the right thing is happening in every case and making sure that the criminal justice system and everybody in it is helping to further racial equality on the whole.
And of course, there's other greater issues at play that we have no control over, right? So economic drivers and, you know, education and all of that. I mean, there's a lot of other bits that need to be worked on in order for us to really see true equity in a holistic manner. But, you know, just got to put that out there too.
If you guys would join me in thanking both of them for coming and sharing with us today. This has been a very serious topic, but I feel enlightened, and I'm sure all of you do as well. And hopefully in our own right, we'll pursue this ourselves. So thanks again.
Thank
Yay.
you so much for having us.
Thank you for having us. This was awesome. Thank you, guys.
We do have two quick announcements. Here's the clicker. Ready? So on Thursdays, if you are interested in meeting new people, come on over to Primera Casa and our next door neighbors Global First Year, where they will have international students that you can hang out with, and it's called, is it Munch and Meet? Meet and Munch, that one. So come on over. We'd love to have you guys on Thursdays at 4 p.m. Also, if you haven't already applied, we hear great things back from students who participate in our Washington, D.C. fly-ins. It's an immersive 3-day virtual experience. One of these days it'll be back in person, but at this time it's virtual. So hurry up. September 30th is approaching very quickly, and we'd love for you guys to apply so you can join that. So that's it for today, folks. I guess we'll see you next week. I hope so.